Hola, settle in, it's story time. Normally on this channel, I tell personal funny stories, but this story is better than anything that's ever happened to me, so I thought I'd try something new. This is a true crime story, but before you dip, if you don't like true crime, let me assure you, this is not a gory, gross story. This story is just weird. It's so wonderfully weird and out there and outlandish. It's got everything. Secrets, sex, and a gin made in a bathtub. It's insane to me that this ever happened, but it did. And now we all get to hear about it because I'm about to tell you about it. POV, it's the 1920s. Economies are booming. Paradigms are shifting. The years themselves are roaring. You would too if you just saw the end of the Spanish flu. Anywho, it's August 22nd, 1922 to be exact. If that's your birthday, happy birthday. But we're talking about murder right now, so stop making it about you. And there's a body riddled with 3 .25 caliber bullet holes lying on the floor of the Oesterreich's home. How did we get ourselves into this mess? Let me tell you the crazy backstory roller coaster ride. Meet Walburga Oesterreich. She went by Dolly. I would too. So Dolly, despite her name, didn't really look like a doll. She was not considered the most attractive woman of her time, but here's the thing you should know about Dolly. She made everything she had work for her. And I find that inspiring isn't strong enough of a word. Galvanizing. I find that galvanizing. Dolly didn't let beauty standards stop her from beguiling a few powerful men to get whatever she wanted. So Dolly is a housewife and homemaker in her early 30s in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. She's married to this man, Fred Oesterreich. Fred owned a super successful textile factory that manufactured mostly aprons. Dolly also worked at the factory as a forelady. She's remembered by the workers there as being kind and caring, especially when juxtaposed by Fred, who was not so nice to them. Newsflash, they're V-wealthy. But Dolly wanted something money can't buy. Lovin', and lots of it. But Fred worked long hours, and if he wasn't working, he was drinking. So he's usually either too busy or too drunk to meet Dolly's needs. If their marriage wasn't out of sync as it was, it's plunged into tragedy when their only child, Raymond, dies at a young age. In an attempt to cope, Fred works more and drinks more. Those who worked for him and with him said he was a difficult man with a temper. Not exactly what Dolly's looking for. But she does find just that when she meets Otto Sandhuber, a 17-year-old sewing machine repairman that works at the Oesterreich's factory. Something to keep in mind about Otto, besides the fact that he's an impressionable, manipulatable 17-year-old, is that he grew up as an orphan without ever knowing his birth parents, and back then this probably really affected his options in life and left him with a childhood wound that made him long to belong and be loved. So when he was sent by Fred to go fix Dolly's at-home sewing machine, and she answered the door in a silk robe, stockings, heavy perfume, and nothing else.
I look so hot in that.
He fell hook, line, and sinker into her trap. Should have worn that for the outfit of this video. Nah, we don't know each other like that. The story goes that her sewing machine was in her bedroom. Seems like a weird place to keep a sewing machine in a big house. Look how big this house is. But I think we all know that the sewing machine is not what Dolly needed Otto to fix. Ooh. It's getting hot in here. Need a booch break. So Otto's inspecting the machine, and when he looks up from his work, he notices that Dolly is lying there on the bed. And every time he surreptitiously glances up at her, she opens her robe a little wider. So they get together. After this initial meeting, they start hooking up at hotels to keep this illicit affair under wraps. But then they start getting messy and meet at the Oesterreich's home. This is a bad move because people didn't have TV or smartphones back then. So where are those neighbors' eyes looking that aren't occupied by screens? Out the window. Nosy neighbors noted Otto's comings and goings. To shut them up, Dolly told neighbors that Otto was her, quote, vagabond half-brother.
So disrespectful!
But some of the neighbors had already told Fred that there was this young hot guy coming around their house while he was at work. And so to get her husband off her trail, Dolly told him that Otto was just some persistent salesman that was pestering her and that she had finally shut him down and he wouldn't be peddling his wares around her anymore. What Dolly actually did to keep her new prize away from these prying eyes was she asked Otto to quit his job and come live rent-free in her attic. This story lives rent-free in my head, that's for sure. To my amazement, Otto was like, oh hell yeah, middle-aged lady, I'll come live in your attic. Which makes me think he probably didn't have a lot of good going on otherwise in his life, but this new setup did allow him to pursue his dreams of writing, having lots of sex, and having a sure place to live. But there were conditions. Dolly told him he couldn't leave the house, ever. Because then people would know he was there, her half-brother. Scandalous. But he was cool with that too. I want to take a moment to acknowledge the double standard that if Dolly was a man and Otto was a 17-year-old girl, the story would be so gross. I know, we were having so much fun. Why must I be the wet blanket that I am?
Every time I try to do something fun or exciting, you make it not that way.
Even so, it is a pretty lurid story that's going on. However, I will also point out that the power dynamics between men and women were a lot different than they are today. When this happened, women had virtually no legal rights. And the 19th Amendment, which effectively only gave white women the right to vote, was only ratified in 1920, 2 years before the murder in this story happens. So any power women had, for the most part, came from their ability to take it by influencing the men in their lives. And Dolly, she's gonna influence quite a few more before this story is over. Let's just keep it in mind, let's just keep it in mind. So Dolly sets up a little desk and a cot for her little boo thing in the attic. And initially, Otto is loving life because by day he gets it on with Dolly and at night he reads mystery novels by candlelight and writes his own Pulp Fiction stories. He also makes his own gin in a bathtub, and down the line Dolly takes some of his stories and even gets them published for him. This would be the dark academia dream come to life for some people. Otto also helps Dolly with household chores during the day. Although Fred and Dolly were loaded, Fred refused to hire any help. And I assume Dolly was cool with that, especially after she started hiding a man in their house. I feel like a maid would blow her cover. So now, all in all, Dolly has got herself a man that does both to clean out literal and metaphorical cobwebs in her literal and metaphorical attic.
So funny.
We go back to the homemade bathtub gin because that really got me thinking.
Today I'm going to show you how to make bathtub gin. So let's go.
What is wrong with me? Why do I romanticize the idea of bathtub gin, prison toilet bowl wine, and redneck deep woods moonshine? I would go blind. I would. 100%. Sorry about that. As you would anticipate, Dolly's husband Fred, as basted in alcohol as he was most of the time, did start to notice some strange things going on at home. He brought up concerns of hearing unexplainable noises, his half-smoked cigars were disappearing, and leftovers he was looking forward to were going missing out of the icebox. Fun fact, according to Otto, Dolly was insatiable. They were having sex 8 to 10 times a day. So I'm amazed that they were able to keep any food in that house ever.
We bought 10 cases of Gatorade and a 40-pound bag of peanuts for energy. Oh, God.
8 to 10 times a day regularly is too much. That's just true. Just anatomically, I do not understand. So how is Dolly gonna deal with her husband's suspicions? Because she's not gonna let anything come between her and her attic-dwelling fella. Dolly is a little gaslighter and lit Fred up into believing that, it's nothing. You're hearing and imagining things. You're drinking too much. You're working too hard, and you're going crazy, Fred. To the point where he actually went to a doctor who could find nothing wrong with him. I mean, you just told him to take it easy and also gave him a little prescription tranquilizer. I feel bad for this man.
Sorry to this man.
I mean, by all accounts, he wasn't a very kind individual, and he certainly neglected his relationship with his wife, but that doesn't mean that he deserves to be psychologically abused and cheated on. You know what I mean? He was a first-generation immigrant. He was a hard worker. He built a successful business. He used his success to give other people opportunities. He hired other immigrants, and he even hired ex-cons that were just trying to get back on their feet after getting out of prison. And he clearly was struggling to cope with the death of his only child in the only ways that he knew how to. But Dolly is able to convince him that nothing is fishy, everything's berries, for 5 years. 5 years. For 5 years, this man was hiding in their attic that was accessible through a panel in Dolly's bedroom closet. Like, can you imagine only talking to one person for 5 years? Well, it doesn't stop there. Fred comes to Dolly and tells her that he wants to expand his business to the West Coast and thinks that they should move to LA. You'd think that this will put an end to the odd arrangement going on, but then you'd be underestimating Dolly. She tells her husband, yeah, I'll move to LA, but I have one condition. Our house has to have an attic. Each region of the US, I mean, well, really the world, everywhere, has different architectural trends. And attics were not trending in LA. But again, this does not stop Dolly. She manages to find a house overlooking Sunset Boulevard with, you guessed it, an attic for her live-in lover. Side note, I looked up attic in the thesaurus because I like to use synonyms to spice things up. Not that this story isn't spicy enough on its own, but I just have to say attic a lot. Anyway, a synonym for attic is cockloft. I'd never heard that term before. So I looked it up in the dictionary, and the definition is a small loft or attic. I'm proposing a second definition. Otto Sandhuber himself. Merriam-Webster, I look forward to hearing from you. So Dolly sends Otto ahead of herself and Fred to get to LA to get himself set up and shut into that attic. And he does. Well, actually, he gets an apartment and works as a janitor for a short stint until Dolly arrives in LA. Which I want to know more about that. There's not a lot about that. I just want to know how it went for him after not talking to another person except for Dolly for 5 years. It's like he's in a one-person cult and Dolly is the leader. But he must not have liked his taste of freedom, because as soon as Dolly landed, he was back up in that attic. Seriously, like, can you imagine only talking to one person, Dolly Oesterreich, for 5 years? And if you can imagine that, can you imagine almost another 5 years of that? Because that's how long he's gonna stay in that attic. They carry on in LA just as they had in Milwaukee. I kinda wanna see someone make a video like, I lived like Dolly Oesterreich for 3 days and here's what I learned. In the video, they stuff a man in their attic and take shots of bathtub gin and just like do laundry 1910s, 20s style. Anyways, yeah, Dolly and Otto go on like this for another 5 years until August 22nd, 1922. Fred and Dolly go out to a party where they're seen quarreling by other partygoers. You don't argue in the 1920s, you quarrel. I assume their fight went something like this. Fred, you zozzled on the gigawater again. That's phonus balonus. I'll tell it to Sweeney. You're embarrassing me, you old bear cat. Okay, I took some liberties and infused some 1920s slang, but basically they had a spat and went home to continue their quarreling without an audience. But there was an audience, and he was listening. Maybe Otto was 3 or 4 bathtub gins deep, we don't know. Everything else that happened this night is based on confessions and their accounts, so who really knows what happens? But this is what happened according to their accounts. Otto claimed that he heard the fight and that he thought it was getting physical and that Fred was hurting Dolly. So he, being madly and sadly in love with her, emerged from his hiding place and burst onto the scene brandishing 2 pistols. Some accounts mention that Fred recognized Otto as his former repairman, except now he's like 10 years older and I'd guess as pale as a ghost, or like translucent like a ghost. So Fred got real angry and the two tussled and a gun ended up going off, shooting Fred, and he died from his injuries. I don't buy either of them being like, the gun went off, because Fred was shot 3 times in the chest. It's not like they were scuffling and someone got shot in the foot or grazed. That's a gun being deliberately aimed and shot multiple times. Also, another article said that one of the shots was to the back of Fred's head. That's an execution style shot. But again, we don't really know exactly what happened. You know, like, it could have been Dolly shooting him. There could have been no fight at all. It could have been planned. Who knows? We don't. What I really want to know, like what I really want to know is, Did Fred piece it together before he died? Like, OMG, this is the guy that I sent to my home 10 years ago to fix Dolly's sewing machine. I haven't seen him since, and he looks a lot like that guy that I saw standing in the attic window that one time from my garden. This is the reason Dolly's been eating for 2 for 10 years. Or did he think, man, I really have gone bonkers like my wife's been telling me? Being murdered would be confusing and terrifying enough. I think I would want to know the truth, but I don't know what I hope for Fred in that moment. After the shooting, Dolly and Otto panic. They know that the neighbors had to have heard the gunshots and that the police will be by soon. So Otto locks Dolly in a closet, which does establish her alibi, but at the same time, I wonder if a small part of him was like, let's see how she likes being cooped up in cramped spaces. Otto takes the guns and the closet key up to the attic and hides. He doesn't flee the scene. He just stays there. In the attic. It's all he knows. So the police get there, the house is dark, they find Fred's body, and then they hear Dolly crying out, Fred, Fred, and knocking on the closet door. They get Dolly out of the closet and they're like, what is all this about? Dolly spins a story for them that she and Fred been married for 20 years, just come home from a party, a real mean bean feast, and she was hanging up her fur in the closet when a burglar pushes her in and locks the door. She tells them at first she thought it was just Fred pulling her leg, but then she realizes that they've surprised a burglar who was in the process of robbing their home, and she hears the struggle, then the gunshots, and the next thing she knows, the police are there asking her what's going on. So she tells the police that the home's been robbed, but really the only thing that they can find missing, English is such a weird language that we use the verb find to describe discovering something is gone. Like, you didn't find anything. You found the absence of something. Anyway, so the only thing they can really find missing, the only thing they can really establish is missing is a diamond-studded pocket watch. The broken chain is still on Fred, but the watch that Dolly tells them she gave to Fred as a gift back when they lived in Milwaukee is nowhere to be found. But also Fred's wallet that was like full of cash was just right there. The police aren't very satisfied with Dolly's explanation, but the burden of proof is on them, and they can't prove that she's not telling the truth. And there had been a series of attempted break-ins in their neighborhood, and they did determine that it was impossible for Dolly to lock herself in a closet. I guess the thought of an accomplice never crossed their minds, but anyway, they have to release her because they don't have any proof that she's involved at all. But they don't like it, especially because neighbors told them some pretty frustrating observations. Neighbors heard the gunshots and they looked out of their windows, as you do, and they noted that 15 to 20 minutes after the gunshots, all the lights went out in the house and they never saw anyone leave the property. The police know that surprise burglars turned murderers don't stay at the scene of the crime. They hightail it out of there. And the cops are also like, Dolly certainly has a motive because she's now the sole owner of their huge fortune. Upon her release, the newly widowed Dolly buys a new house and Otto moves in with her into the attic. You thought that just because Fred's out of the picture now, they're gonna start living together normally? No! I mean, I totally thought that too. I don't mean to be like, you big dummy. No, these two are just not normal. You know, they think they have a good thing going. Dolly has a live-in sex slave, and Otto just saved up enough money from publishing his stories to buy a typewriter that Fred isn't around to hear the typing of. Feels wildly unbalanced, but that's what they were into. And Otto's gonna live in this third attic for a while longer. Some people like to live in houses. Some people favor apartments. Some people prefer to live in hotels. This guy just really loves a nice sweaty attic. That, or he's been in this weird setup for so long that he is incapable of imagining a life outside of Dolly's attic. From there, Dolly cozies up with her new estate lawyer, Herman Shapiro, who she hired to manage her affairs, so like, why not have an affair with him? Just makes sense. Dolly logic. Anyways, Dolly gives him a really generous birthday present.
So you just gonna bring me a birthday gift on my birthday to my birthday party on my birthday with a birthday gift? Happy birthday?
It's the diamond-studded pocket watch that was alleged to have been stolen in the burglary. The main detective investigating Fred's murder, Detective Klein, finds out that Herman has this timepiece and that he's also Dolly's new side piece. Herman claims that he didn't know that the watch was alleged to be stolen, so Klein brings in Dolly to grill her. Dolly explains that she thought the watch was stolen, but that she later found it in between some couch cushions and thought it must have fallen between there during the scuffle. She didn't think it was a big deal, and she didn't think to notify police about it. But this really bugs Detective Klein, who wonders if Herman was party to the crime. But it's a dead end because they are able to determine that Herman and Dolly had never met before the murder. The case goes cold for another year until loose lips sink ships. During that last year, Dolly got herself a third boyfriend. Where does this woman find the time? Dolly started dating Roy Klum, who was a movie producer. Roy actually knew both Dolly and Fred real well. They were friends back in Wisconsin. The couple had even loaned him money. And while they're dating, Dolly propositions Roy to return the favor. She gives him a package that he said looked and felt like a gun. Dolly told him to get rid of it because it looked an awful lot like the gun that was used by the burglar, and she didn't want the cops to find it and get confused. And Roy didn't ask a lot of questions, he just yeeted the thing into the La Brea tar pits. I used to live by those things. They stink, and I can totally see why someone would think something they threw in there is never gonna see the light of day again. But it did, because after a year of dating, the two break up, and Roy, the spurned lover, tells the cops everything. They're able to retrieve the gun from the tar pits, Dolly is brought into custody, and with the case back in the papers, a new player comes out of the woodwork. Turns out Dolly had cajoled her neighbor into hiding the other gun for her as well. He dug a hole under some of his rose bushes, buried it, and hid it for a year before turning it over to authorities. So now they think they got her. Dolly's in jail, awaiting trial. Where is Otto in all of this? In the attic, of course. Just chilling, just vibing, but he's probably getting pretty hungry. Dolly, out of concern for Otto, begs Herman to bring groceries over to what he thinks is a empty house. Dolly explains that her vagabond brother is living in the attic and that Herman needs to go over and scratch on the door to the attic or knock on the ceiling. Different articles say different things. And he does, because he's a man in Dolly's life, and Dolly seems to be able to get any man in her life to do whatever the heck she wants. When Herman brings home the bacon, Otto emerges.
Oh, there's my little chef.
Now remember, Herman is Dolly's lawyer, but he's also her boyfriend. You have to imagine that after 10 years of talking to no one except for Dolly, he's probably forgotten some social norms along the way. Because he just starts telling Herman about all of the sex that he's had with Dolly, all the steamy details. He's kissed and he's waited 10 years to tell somebody about it. And I don't know, maybe he's been dipping into that bathtub gin, so I just like to imagine him like drunkenly oversharing all of this with Herman. This infuriates Herman, who kicks Otto out of Dolly's house and tells him to never come back. And now, after a decade of living this like agoraphobic lifestyle, Otto has to leave his attic. Which must have been terrifying for him, honestly. So he moves to Canada, maybe because everyone there is nice, maybe he just really likes poutine. I don't know, both are valid reasons. Anywho, he starts living under his pen name, Walter Klein. He meets and marries a Canadian woman, and they move back down to LA after a while, not sure how long. And we'll check back in on Walter later, who I will now henceforth refer to as Otto to avoid confusion. So Dolly is on trial for months, during which they're trying to dig up more evidence on her besides the guns. They've already unearthed those, and they're still scratching their heads on how she locked herself in the closet. They just can't figure it out.
Figured out.
You figured out. You figured out.
And it turns out the tar pits might preserve animal fossils, but not so with guns. In fact, both of the guns were so badly corroded that they couldn't prove either of them had been used to murder Fred. Dolly leads a charmed life. They can't get her. They just can't. So she's released on bail, and the charges are dropped shortly thereafter due to lack of evidence. So she goes home, back to her empty house. It's lonely. This woman, she can't live alone, so Herman moves in, but he doesn't have to live in the attic. They're together for 7 more years, and their relationship is rocky!
The world ain't all sunshine and rainbows.
Herman discovers that Dolly's having an affair with a man named Ray Burt Hendrick. Yes, Ray Burt Hendrick. And so he calls it quits and moves all the way to St. Louis. But here's the thing, he's still really mad at her, and he's been harboring all of these secrets about what really happened to Fred that he's pieced together over the years. So he pens a big long affidavit all about it and sends it off to the authorities. They arrest both Dolly and Otto. Dolly is charged with conspiracy, Otto with murder. The press goes nuts with this story. It's sensational and shocking. It's like the juiciest little fruit they ever heard of. The papers call Otto a lot of names, but the one that sticks is Batman.
Nothing was off limits. It was like an all-you-can-fuck buffet.
Likening his attic situation to that of cave-dwelling bats, and everyone eats it up. There's conflicting accounts of how it all went down on Otto's side, so I'm just gonna like kind of smash it all together and give you my best guess. So when he's taken into custody, he spilled all his beans. All his beans. I'm watching too much Letterkenny. He confesses to everything at first. In his confession, he paints living in the attic in a positive light, and he calls himself a sort of hero that was just trying to defend Dolly. I don't think, no matter your disposition, I am incredibly introverted, and I just don't think that living in an attic and talking to one person for 10 years is healthy for anyone on any level, and it obviously must have really affected him. I think Otto thought he had it good. A lot of the times people think they have it good or good enough because they don't know what good is. A lot of times people won't realize that they had it bad until they experience something good and are able to look back and be like, oh sheesh, that was bad. That was real bad. Oh, this is prevalent in a lot of abusive relationships. So by the time he's on trial, he pleads not guilty by reason of insanity. Prosecutors want to give him the death penalty. Otto is asked a lot of interesting questions on the stand that expose the Oedipal nature of his and Dolly's relationship. You gotta remember, like, Dolly had lost her son a few years before this all happened. She wanted someone to take care of. Otto's an orphan. He's finally got someone who's like taking care of his needs, but it's also like sexual, so it's like, yeah, it's not as fun as we all thought it was. Otto even reveals that when he and Dolly would fight, he would refuse to eat because he saw it as the only defense available to him, and after a while he would start again behaving himself. And when asked what behaving himself meant, it meant having sex with Dolly. And he later personally described himself as being a sex slave. I don't think anything that was going on there was the least bit healthy. And Otto's defense team described him as having the mentality of an 8-year-old boy. So sorry for the soggiest wet blanket moment. Ah, God. Let's just hope that his marriage with the Canadian Matilda was just a lot better. So yeah, his defense is like he was manipulated and enslaved by the dominant Dolly, and the jury takes pity on Otto and refuses to charge him with murder, especially after they personally checked out the attic that he was living in. So instead they find him guilty of manslaughter, which would mean a 1 to 10 year sentence at that time. But then Otto's lawyer is like, hey, Your Honor, isn't there a 3-year statute of limitations on manslaughter here in California at the time of this crime and trial? And the judge was like, oh, huh, yeah, have a nice day. And Otto freely walks out of the courtroom into obscurity, never to be heard from by history again. I think he had kids though. Some articles say he went on to have kids, or that he already had kids. Anyway, he had kids, probably. Let's talk about Dolly's separate trial. She had this great attorney for the times, Jerry Geisler, who deadlocked the jury. They just could not agree and refused to change their minds, so it was a hung jury. So she's acquitted, and in 1936, the indictment against her is dropped due to lack of evidence. So the extremely charming Dolly goes on to lead her extremely charmed life. So remember that guy that Herman Shapiro broke up with Dolly over her cheating on him with? Gosh, that is such a web. Raybert Hendrick? I don't know anything about this man, except that Dolly, by all accounts, was with him and only him for the next 30 years. And maybe that tells us everything we need to know. So after 30 years, they get married. So Dolly, although she was married to Fred for like 20-some years, I think in her heart she was like, I am not the marrying type. I can't settle down. I can't stop or I'll die. So when she married Ray, she did. She died 2 weeks later. And that is the steamy, soggy story of Fred Oesterreich's murder. Now this whole thing has gotten me very curious about what's in my attic. I've never been up there. Only my husband's been up there. And he's told me not to go up there because there could be rats or bats or something, I don't know. But maybe that's just his cover. What if in a surprise reversal, my husband has like a lady from LA hidden up there? I have to check it out. I don't think my husband's cheating on me, by the way. I just wanted to establish a fun narrative for me looking in the attic. Okay, let's go. Ah, oh my gosh. You guys, I don't know if I can do this. I heard a noise. Oh, now I have to go look. I don't even know how this works. Whoa! Okay. These stairs are warm. That's kind of like freaking me out, but it's also kind of inviting. This is how I get rabies. This is 100% how I get rabies. Hello? Is anyone up here? It's just me. Oh, okay. No one's living up here. This is too small, even for Otto. Oh, there's a room over there. Let me know if you enjoyed this video by liking it or chatting with me in the comments. And stay out of attics and abusive relationships. Okay, bye!